Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's EBC. We're in Seattle, Washington still, and we're outside the 9th Circuit Courthouse here thinking a little bit about power. And we're actually thinking about power from the context of the things that in our lives we allow to take control or have authority over us. This week's story is Mark 6 verses 14 to 29. And it's a really disturbing story because it is the story of the beheading of John the Baptist. And what I'm going to do is let's talk about the story first and then talk about what it means for us. So in this story, Herod has John in prison. And Herod actually, it says, kind of likes talking to John. He's perplexed by John, but he also likes listening to John. And so we know that Herod himself is not going to do anything to actually kill John because Herod kind of likes John. And Herod understands that John is a holy man and that Herod doesn't want to kill him. So, but one night they're having a party and Herod is married to a woman named Herodias, and Herodias has a daughter. And there's some distinctions in the ancient texts as to what the daughter's name was, but for these purposes, so that we don't get completely confused, let's call her Salome. So Herodias' daughter Salome is at the party, and Salome dances for all the guests. And it's a fantastic dance, apparently. And Herod really likes it and declares just impetuously, "Tell me whatever you want, even up to half my kingdom, and I will give it to you." Now, Salome doesn't immediately answer. She goes back to her mother and says, "What should I ask for?" And Herodias, who doesn't like John the Baptist, with all the opportunity to ask for anything in the world up to half the kingdom, says, "Give me the head of John the Baptist." Now, so Salome goes back to Herod and says, "The head of John the Baptist," and she even adds the sort of the terrible detail, "on a platter." And Herod now is stuck because he has said he would give her anything, even up to half the kingdom. And it says specifically in the Bible that he's worried about the oath that he gave, he's worried about his guests. And based on those two things, he decides he has to do it. He goes and he kills John the Baptist and he beheads John the Baptist, and that's how the story ends. It's a terrible story, right? But I want to think about it from the standpoint of the ways in which we let other things exert power and authority over us that we shouldn't. And let's think about the three main characters here in this story. All right, so first of all, we have Herodias, who is presented with this opportunity through her daughter, that her daughter could receive anything her daughter wanted, up to half the kingdom. Now, what does she allow to control her? It's her hatred for John. It's her sense of revenge or a sense of a grudge that she has. And she lets that control her, even when her own best interests would have been to ask for something like, half of the kingdom. Then you have Salome, who, instead of answering on her own behalf, has allowed other people to tell her what to do. And when Herodias says to her, "Go and ask for the head of John the Baptist," she doesn't just, she doesn't think about it. She doesn't try to push back on it. I mean, we don't hear any details like that. Instead, she embellishes the ask. She seizes upon the ask and says, and in fact, the head of John the Baptist on a platter, right? It's a terrible piece of the story. All right. So, and then you have Herod. And Herod is, in fact, the most interesting of these characters, in part because Herod has all the power. Herod could do whatever Herod wanted. It's his kingdom. And yet, having already blurted out impetuously, "I'll give you anything you want," what he allows to control him are those ridiculous statements that he made, the oath that he perceives, and that crazy sense of honor that he has with his guests, that if he goes back on his word, somehow he'll be lesser for it. So he's letting that control him. Each of these people has something that is controlling them. And I think the lesson for us, by the way, in such a terrible story, one lesson you could take away from it is bad things do happen, and we know that there are evil people in the world, and the Bible certainly does let us know that in this story. But I think if we focus on the ways in which people are allowing power and authority to work through them in ways that should not be happening, are allowing those things to control them in ways that should not be happening, we can be reminded to not allow those things to happen ourselves. Okay. Now, I want to mention just two other things because there's a great bookend on this story. There's one at the beginning and one at the end. And I want to think about those for just a moment. So when this story arises in Mark 6, it's because, crazy enough, Herod is hearing the things that Jesus is doing, and Herod thinks it's John the Baptist come back. That's the explanation that Herod has for these things. So even after he's allowed his oath and his guests to control what he does, he's still tormented by the things that he's done. And it's a good reminder to us that when we don't choose to do the right thing, we wind up being tormented by it much more than the choices we made at the time. And then the other bookend here is that when John is killed, the Bible pauses to mention that John's disciples come and take his body and bury it. And, that's authority and control being exercised in a way in which John's disciples knew what the right thing was to do. And even if it was at some risk to them, they went ahead and did that. They went ahead and made sure that they did the right thing to help bury John's body. And so it tells us that there are opportunities that we have to choose to do the right thing, even in the face of maybe, a little bit of risk. But let's make sure that this week we're not letting the grudges and other things control us. Let's make sure that this week we're choosing to do the right thing. Everyone, have a great week.